Hi, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining. And I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today. And I'm very excited because I'm joined by a great stack of panelists and great experts in the market. And you probably know we're here to discuss NatCat operational strategies for asset owners and operators. So today, I will be showcasing a little bit of what we'll be discussing, and we'll jump into the webinar. In case you haven't heard of us before, we at Solarplaza organize solar energy conferences throughout the world, and we are a Dutch-based company here in Rotterdam. Next year, we're celebrating the 10th edition of our Solar Asset Management North America Conference in San Diego. And this webinar is also in preparation of this conference. So I invite you to check this out. If you want to keep the conversation going and maybe meet many of the speakers here today in person, then you should come join us in April in San Diego. And we even have a special little discount for you for having attended this webinar at the end of the slides. So you can keep an eye out for that. In case you have any technical issues or any questions for the panelists, I please invite you to use the question box on your control panel on the right-hand side. Feel free to put in questions for the speakers throughout the webinar. I'll try to get through as many as I can, so there's no need to leave them until the end. And we will be sharing these presentation slides and the full recordings after the webinar has taken place. Now, today we will be starting off the webinar with just a brief presentation from Scott van Pelt from Game Change Solar, and then going straight into this debate with our panelists. And there's a lot to go over, so I will go ahead and start introducing the panelists, actually asking them to introduce themselves. First up, I would like to give the floor to Nick de Vries, Chief Technology Officer at Silicon Ranch, who is joining us today. Nick, if you'd like to say a few words, go ahead.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever everyone is. I'm Nick de Vries. Silicon Ranch owns, my department operates solar power plants that I designed and built over a decade ago. We operate in 15 states across the nation, and take pride in never sold a project. We own them. We sell electricity. Having our power plants operational, ensuring that they're resilient, delivering energy at all times is important to us, important to the business. So this is a topic that is important to us as well, and that it's one of those many things that could prevent us from delivering energy to our customers, first and foremost. Second, it's expensive if there's damage to deal with. So we'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'll pass on the microphone to James Wagstaff, who's the Chief Revenue Officer at Raptor Maps.
Thanks, Lorena. Appreciate the chance to be on the webinar today. Nice to speak with you all who have joined. As Lorena mentioned, I'm James Wagstaff with Raptor Maps. I look after the commercial side of our house, so support our customer base globally. For those that aren't familiar with Raptor Maps, we provide a system of record for solar assets. Our platform includes analytics and digital tools that help improve site performance. And relevant for the discussion today, in particular, our platform and services are used by owners and operators and O&M firms to document and measure the physical conditions of sites, both before and after natural catastrophes. Raptor Maps is active in over 50 countries, and we have nearly 10,000 solar plants on our platform.
Wow.
Thank you, James. Impressive number. I'll go ahead for one of our next speakers, Isaac Mclean, who's the Chief Underwriting Officer at KWH Analytics.
Good morning. I'm Isaac Mclean, the Chief Underwriting Officer. I'm responsible for a couple of insurance products that KWH sells. So we have our solar revenue put, which ensures production output for solar assets, as well as earlier this year, we launched our property insurance program with a particular focus on NatCat exposed property, where my expertise lies, coming from another insurance carrier that focused on NatCat exposed property business. We also have a third of the industry's production data and use that to do DOE work, as well as additional analytics to help support the industry.
Thank you, Isaac. And I'm curious to hear your insights on the insurance side. I'll move on to Reegan Moen, who is the Vice President of Business Development at Solv Energy, to say a few words.
Good day, everyone. Lorena, thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. I think it's an important subject. Solv Energy is a standalone company, previously known as Swinnerton Renewable Energy and Solv Inc. As an EPC and O&M provider, we are one of the largest EPCs in the country, as well as one of the largest O&M providers, managing over 10 gigawatts of solar across the country in 26 states. We have unfortunate experience with dealing with a lot of the hail issues and other NatCat issues that we all are faced with. So hopefully I'm able to come to this panel and talk about what we as a provider can do to be able to help mitigate that as much as possible and help owners get best insurance rates for their premiums and coverage as possible. Thanks for allowing me to be here.
Thanks, Reegan. It's great to have you. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to give the floor to Scott and Pelt to give an introduction. And Scott, right after your introduction, feel free to go ahead and give your also introduction to the webinar itself.
Sounds good. So I'm Scott Van Pelt, Chief Engineer at Game Change Solar. Game Change is one of the largest designers and providers of racking systems globally, particularly in North America. We sell both fixed tilt and tracker systems. So we have kind of a unique perspective on being able to speak to both types of racks. And at Game Change, I am responsible for all of our technical deliverables. I'm also a licensed professional engineer in 22 states, and I've acted as the structural engineer of record on some 300 plus solar power plants. So with that, we can move into some prepared notes. Next slide. So I was asked to kind of set the stage, if you will, on what is the current methodology for designing against natural catastrophes and addressing different weather conditions. And we'll focus mostly on tracker systems. Fixed tilt systems don't move. There's no real decision to be made on the part of owners or operators. But for tracker systems, single axis tracking system, there's a concept in the industry of Stow. Stow referring to a certain tilt angle that the solar modules are rotated to given certain weather conditions on site. And in that position, that system is designed to have its best chance of surviving that certain weather condition and minimizing any sort of damage. Next slide. So there are a large number of different weather conditions that tracker vendors design for. Some of them are listed here. You've already heard some mentions to hail certainly being one of the biggest concerns in the industry right now, but also wind, both in terms of the pressure that the wind event applies to the modules, as well as what's referred to as air elastic stability. So some kind of more common terms for this are flutter or galloping, but this refers to kind of self-feeding negative condition where the modules will rock back and forth, ultimately at unacceptable levels and cause damage to the system. Hopefully during the conversation in a couple minutes, we'll be able to talk about some more of these topics and the different ways that various tracker OEMs and operations staff address them. And kind of note that it will vary between tracker OEM, right? So what Game Change's perspective is on addressing high winds and hurricane loads may differ from other OEMs in the industry. Next slide. So one of the major things I expect we'll talk about in a couple minutes is preventative stowing and how you get the information or the signal to stow out to the power plant. From your NOC, from your network operations center, how do you address this preemptively, or do you wait for some sort of on-site measurement to initiate that go to stow mechanism? So typically we'll see weather forecasting used for a number of different types of weather conditions. In particular for hurricanes, it's very common. The site knows that a hurricane is coming. The tracker system will preemptively be moved to a stow orientation to that most robust orientation. But there's certainly some debate about for hail, is it better to go to Stow based on forecasting or on-site measurement? And I expect we'll get into that here in a couple minutes. And then some other things to consider. So I mentioned preventative stowing, and so there are different remote operations you can do to orient the tracker tables, particularly before a hurricane, but also for things as simple as cleaning modules. One thing to consider when selecting a tracker OEM is, what are their backup power requirements? Are they supplying backup power? If the power goes down during a hurricane or during some other natural catastrophe, the grid power goes down, is there power on site to orient the modules into that stow position where they're most likely to minimize damage? Some other considerations, just emergency stops or E-stops. Right? This is typically required by relevant UL standards, but making sure that those are on site to protect any O&M staff on site. And lastly is a consideration that'll vary pretty significantly between tracker OEMs, is what tilt angles and what wind directions, what tilt angles are the trackers being stowed at? Are they being stowed into the wind? Are they being stowed at a certain angle regardless of wind direction? Are they being stowed flat? These decisions are going to vary between tracker OEMs, and that information is then fed to owners and asset managers to help them identify what is the best configuration for that given system in terms of minimizing the likelihood of damage during some severe weather event. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context on kind of what's common in the industry now in terms of preparing for and addressing natural catastrophes and severe weather events, and looking forward to discussing this more with my panelists.
Thank you, Scott, for contextualizing this. And I do want to dive into the discussion, but first, I really want to know from the audience, before we start talking about all these different NatCat strategies, I'm quite curious to know, how prepared does the audience feel? Like, if you're working with solar projects, which I imagine you probably are being in this webinar, how prepared are you leading up to the NatCat event? Do you have mitigation strategies in place? And maybe you are a master of disaster, maybe you're extremely prepared, or perhaps you're more moderately prepared with the evolving strategies in place. Maybe you're testing the waters, minimally prepared, and maybe you don't even have an umbrella, and that's why you're attending this webinar, but this really means you have no preparations in place at all. But I really like to know, so that we get a better feel while discussing, what is your perspective? Do you feel prepared for these events, or maybe not as prepared as you think you should be? I'll give you guys one moment to answer this. In the meantime, I think I'm already, well, I'll still give a few more moments, because before we start discussing, I'm quite curious about the audience. But I'd like to ask my fellow panelists, this might be a biased questions, but what would you answer for yourself?
Yeah, I'll go first. This is Reegan with Solv Energy. As an operator, I think we don't want to say we're the complete expert, because there are so many new things coming into the market that help us get better at what we do. But we definitely have it at the front edge of our thinking, how we're operating plant, working with the owners and working with asset managers to be able to mitigate damage as much as possible.
Okay, well, let's see if that is also reflective of what the audience has said. And it does seem like that is a bit of the feeling. Most people are moderately to masterfully prepared, which is great. I guess that also highlights how important this topic is. But we also have some people in the room who are also going to benefit a lot from the knowledge you'll be sharing, because you're the umbrella that they want to hold to save them in this downpour. So great to have a bit of that picture. It seems clear that NatCat strategies aren't new, though, especially from this poll response. But I would like to ask first, perhaps to you, Isaac, what do you think are the main trends or changes that you've seen with regards to this topic in the last few years?
Yeah, really, we started seeing some larger hail losses in the industry kind of in 2019, 2020. And so hail stow capabilities utilizing the trackers and as well as panel selection has really improved over the last 3 years. I'd say like hail stow capabilities still is relatively new. And as a property carrier, when we see requests for quotes, we see a wide variety of preparedness. And so we'll ask those questions, but also give feedback. I think this is helpful to kind of talk about best practices and capabilities that sites can implement, even if they're not able to implement them right away, and work towards it long term to improve industry resilience. So very beneficial.
And how about yourself, Nick? Have you seen any changing trends or growing interest on the topic?
Look, without a doubt, growing interest really in the past 2 to 3 years. The change in insurance rates really was the marker that got people's attention. And but even still, trackers have always, it was hail, I think, that really got people's attention 2 to 3 years ago. Wind has always been present. Hurricanes and strong winds coming off of mountains has always been a part of trackers and solar. But really, the new features that have come out in many of the tracker products, I feel, have come around the area of hail.
I see. I imagine maybe, Scott, you see this as well on the tracker side, that higher interest due to the recent hail issue.
Absolutely. So there's, I'll agree with the previous comments. So hail certainly more of interest recently, and we've been doing work with various consultants looking at the likelihood of hail and how to working with some vendors on hail forecasting. So, and I'll go a little bit technical. So for NERC compliant sites in the US, there's cybersecurity requirements that complicate some of that hail mitigation. So we've been looking at that very closely, working with different O&M providers to ensure that when the site is under a hail warning, that the man or woman in the network operations center is alerted to that, and they then have the ability to decide whether or not they want to go into that stow position. The other thing that I want to note is going forward, right, that the industry continues to essentially raise the bar on reliability. That with the forthcoming 2024 edition of the model code for all the state codes across the country, that utility ground mount solar arrays are going to be explicitly called out as it's called risk category 2. And so there's going to be a modest increase in the design wind speed that I, as a structural engineer, and my peers are going to be expected to design to. So certainly there's kind of it's a good thing for the industry that we have to address more of these concerns, but it is a rising bar over time.
Perfect. Well, then maybe to reflect that high level of sophistication, we have providers like Raptor Maps who have a lot of data available. And maybe I'd like to ask you, James, how can asset managers best integrate this NatCat data into their strategy for mitigation? Maybe when or how should they do this?
Yeah, there's probably 2 ways that we think about it. The first one is more generally in terms of communicating with the insurance provider on strategies that the owner has deployed to ensure that they're managing risk appropriately. So as Nick mentioned, premiums are really substantial for sites in high-risk areas. And so the conversation with insurers around, what methodologies exist for risk management has become really important, and having data in those discussions is important too. So kind of generally speaking, that's one maybe a trend, I guess you could say, that we're seeing. The second one's a little more tactical in terms of what owners or operators could do during an event or before an event. And so from our vantage point, it's very important to have a baseline of information around the site in terms of physical condition, visual observation, documentation of the equipment. So serial numbers, for example, of the modules, anomalies that might be present at the site before an event, so you can quantify what occurred before and after. There's a sort of a huge list, if you will, of things that owners will want to document around the condition of a site before an event. And then once there's a natural catastrophe, being able to quickly observe the site's condition thereafter, and then comparing and quantifying what's occurred to prepare for a claim if required. So having the information and the tools available to move through that process really quickly is a strategy that we would advise clients on.
For sure. And Reegan, in the various assets that you've been managing, do you feel like that baseline of information is available? Do people value the importance of not only receiving that information after the NatCat event has taken place, but having all of that before?
Yeah, it's extremely important to be able to have that type of information. Just thinking about over the last year, really, I've experienced this ramp up of awareness from owners who have a heightened need to understand what we as a O&M provider can do, or are we prepared for, and how we react, and more specifically to hail events. You know, we've seen the heightened awareness due to the number of projects being built in West Texas, and now Oklahoma going into Arkansas, in the mid from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, even in the southeast as well. So the number of clients who are asking us as a O&M provider, hey, what do you do? What can you do? We're in a position where we're going to be managing 50 NERC sites by the end of next year. We have a 24/7 operations control center. Most of the sites that we operate have full-time techs on site. So to be able to understand how the site was looking at commission, and then when an event occurs, what happens with us is we get a phone call from either the asset manager or the owner saying, hey, we see a potential hail event coming onto our site. We want you to go into stale mode. We have a process. We go ahead and alert our team on site that we are potentially going to go into hail stow mode. I think safety is paramount, especially when you have a site that is staffed with full-time technicians. We verify that the stow command has taken place. We continue to monitor the weather event. Post-weather event, we go activation, and by that, we've got to verify that all trackers pick back up, and then we do the evaluation. So exactly what James is talking about, from a aerial thermography or just a visual going out to the site, see what kind of damage, you know, did a smaller hail make on the site, or did we have success in mitigating that as much as possible. So definitely have to have that clearness of what that procedure looks like. Having a before and after picture of a potential or an actual hail event is vital in not only the understanding of how production impacting that event was, but if there was cause for damage, then communicating that to the insurance companies and then strategize the next steps.
I imagine on the insurance side, if you have that data of exactly which material or what it was impacted, it's easy to make that or at least easier to make that insurance claim with that data. I actually already have a question from the audience, and I would like to integrate it into the discussion we're having right now. I think it's good more for you, Isaac, because it's a question from Kenneth, and it's asking if solar PV insurers still offer insurance on hail. Apparently, they've been receiving conflicting news that in previous webinars they might have stopped offering these kinds of insurance. And I don't know if you could provide some insight into that.
Yeah, for sure. So carriers are still providing insurance. I know we talked about like rates increasing. So we have seen rates on the rise, even into 2023, particularly in hail zones. But the terms and conditions that carriers are offering, particularly for hail, are scaled back in most instances. So where you might have a full limit for what we call attritional or non-NatCat perils, so like simple things like theft, vandalism, cars driving off the road through the site, you'll have full limits on your site for those perils. But for hail, you'll have a sub-limit. So the insurance carrier will offer maybe only 20% of the site's limit that can be applied to hail. And so you do see scaled back coverage options. Working with a broker, they may be able to find or may offer an excess hail, so additional coverage on top of the initial or primary policy to get limits. But a lot of that is not. It's fair to say that there's not full limits being provided on hail in many instances. So a bit of a challenge, and there is some shared exposure between the insurance carrier and the asset owner in those instances. I think, touching base on what we were just discussing, sharing that information and what asset owners are doing to protect their site is very helpful. So I've gotten accounts that we've reviewed where we've seen like how many Stow calls have been made for a site, how many times they've put it in Stow over the last year to show that they're implementing those strategies. That's beneficial to a carrier. I don't think all carriers are taking that into consideration, but pushing that information to carriers is very beneficial and will improve the terms and the limits that asset owners are able to get long term. I will say, if you've got like a fixed tilt site with very thin panels and no stow capabilities in a high hail zone, it will be the terms and conditions that carriers will offer are oftentimes cost prohibitive. We have seen that.
Well, thank you for the clarification, Isaac. And I think you brought up an important question that I actually want to ask Nick here, our in-house owner, asset owner. The question of Stow, of course, that's a great method to kind of protect some of the technology in these kinds of NatCat situations. But who is responsible for taking the decision, yes, we will stow our products or not? I think that's a big responsibility to carry. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that, Nick, and who can make that decision.
Look, ultimately, the buck stops with the asset owner on virtually everything that goes on with the power plant. But it's a shared, a shared decision, in that you're always working with an O&M provider or who owns the NOC. Even Silicon Ranch, we have a NOC. We have our own O&M staff in some states, but everyone has a blended operation just like we do. And so ultimately, it's your O&M provider or the NOC operator who will execute the commands or receive the information at real time that for instance, from the weather forecasts. This is important. They're 24/7. Hail can come in the evenings. So, but it's the asset owner that sets the conditions, the guidance, sets the call it the command climate, that says this is the leadership climate. This is what we're interested in. This is the type of risks we're willing to take or not willing to take. Honestly, by saying nothing, you're saying I'm willing to take all sorts of risks, right? You actively need to say, these are the conditions that I want to guard against. This is the climate of operation. I want the sites cleaned. I want the sites dress so that wind comes through, the trash is not coming up and becoming a part of the problem itself. So asset owners have to set the command climate, but ultimately a lot of the most intimate decisions about when exactly to stow, are the conditions present, needs to be real time, needs to be very decentralized down to the actual operators.
I think that's a great point to make, and I'd love to hear from Reegan. How do you see that relationship between O&M team and the asset owner, and how to improve it on these case situations?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Nick. Bottom line, it's all about communication. We're going to have eyes on the site. We'll have technicians at the site. They can see, and if they live in the area, they know when a potential weather event is going to happen. But the ultimate call is typically coming from the owner or the asset manager. But there's got to be some sort of communication. There's some technology and unique things that I'm seeing in the industry, specifically with Kevin Christie from LightSource, who is considering how do we automate some of those stow commands, and what are the safety precautions that need to happen before a tracker goes into stow. Our technicians in a safe environment, so that if it does go into stow, they're away from it. But to be able to then be aware of that event, put the site into stow, and then the whole follow-up aspect of it, it is such a key communication role between owner asset manager who could have that in-house. It could be a third party, as well as us as the O&M provider and our control center. Communication is vital.
Okay, and have you seen a variety of preparedness or communication level, or would you say it's pretty standardized at this point?
Now, there's definitely different approaches. Like I said, I think new type of technology or software that can drive a Stow command to a control center. And it goes back to maybe a weather service like a DTN or NG or a others that are out there that have polygons that reference the NOAA polygons and look at history of data versus current data and whether a hail event is impending. And to be able to put a plant into Stow, typically it's going to be lower radiance anyway. You know, the amount of production loss to be safe is probably the best answer. So there's definitely new approaches, new ways of doing it, whether it be through emails to a control center, phone calls, email and a follow-up phone call. It's definitely changing. I think what I talked about earlier, how insurance companies who, you know, they put premiums on a site. Honestly, I don't think a lot of them understand how to insure a solar site of these sizes, right? When you have a 500 megawatt site, I urge owners and developers to be able to get their insurance companies to visit your O&M provider or your control center to understand that process. I don't think they're educated in the field as well as they should be, and I think insurance companies are getting better at it. But for them to understand, yeah, we have techs on site full time. We have a control center that has eyes on it. Here's our procedure, our weatherization plan, our mitigation plan. I think it provides a little bit of comfort for the insurance providers to help with those premiums being lowered.
I see. And I wonder, Scott, a similar question to you. Do you feel that there's a different levels of preparedness or understanding of when to store or when not to? Is this something that you feel also as the manufacturer you're responsible to educate whoever is supplying your technology, or is it well understood at this point?
No, so we are absolutely responsible for educating our clients, the owners, the operators about the different weather conditions that should trigger a stow in our opinion. And as the engineer who's responsible for the site, right, I consider that part of my responsibility. That is the power plant operating the way it was designed to. So, you know, and Nick and Reegan may have a different opinion than me, but right, I certainly want the owners and the operators at least reading the O&M manuals and listening to the guidance of the tracker OEMs, even if you all make your own decision, right? You know, our goal is to educate the owners so that, okay, if there's a hailstorm coming, here's what you do. If there's a hurricane coming, here's what you do. If it's going to be particularly cold and there's concern about battery life, you know, here's how the system's expected to operate. So we spend a rather significant amount of time trying to educate our owners and the operators of the plants we design on how should the power plant operate during that weather event.
Yeah. Look,
Nick,
I cannot disagree with Scott. I love reading manuals, and but seriously, the manuals and the structural design drawings will tell you what wind speeds, right? You need to it'll exceed the structural capacity of the racking, and when stow is counted on. And as an owner, we need to see that the commissioning was tested to that speed, and that and it actually works, because all this technology is great. You can have your brands, you can say I bought the right stuff, but unless it was commissioned, right, you have a false sense of security. That ties the great work that professional engineers do, such that operators can actually count on it, right? So that insurers can know it's in place, and as owners we can say be properly protected.
Great, Nick. I wasn't going to put you on the spot and ask if you've read those manuals, but great that you already took it upon yourself, answered that yes, it's important. And I think that's the perspective that most asset owners should have. I'd like to go back a little bit on the insurance questions, because I think that's quite relevant on the topic at hand. And I think in the scenario we have right now, where asset owners are sometimes inheriting projects post-construction in quite challenging regions, maybe facing obstacles in updating insurance and often settling for higher premiums. I would like to know, Isaac, what kind of strategies or solutions would you recommend for insurance companies to facilitate maybe more accessible or more reasonably priced coverage for these kinds of projects, or just recommendations in general for any asset owner or developer working in difficult regions?
No, absolutely. I think it's about being proactive in your communication. I think there's a bit of what I consider kind of the telephone game, where asset owners have information, or even the O&M providers have information that would support better terms and conditions on a policy, and sharing that information through the asset owner, through the broker, to the insurance carrier or carriers that are participating on the insurance. There's sometimes information lost in translation. Like I want to know whether or not the asset owner has read the manuals and tested to that capability, but that doesn't always come through in a submission. The insurance term for that is pride of ownership. Do they have that pride of ownership, like that Nick displays, where he says he's never sold an asset, he intends to operate them? That's important to a carrier, but not all carriers consider it the same way. And so I believe KWH as a carrier is on the forefront of that, and we've been trying to be very open in communicating that. So even if we're not going to provide a formal quote in an account because we don't feel like the terms and conditions that the market's providing may not be appropriate, we still want to give that feedback and say, hey, we believe this is the peril that's the largest consideration. You know, maybe if you need to implement a Stow program, that would improve the resiliency of the site and help improve the terms. We try to give that information back and be pretty open with it, because we do think other carriers should take those things into consideration. We've got feedback from asset owners that, you know, I'm near a flood zone, but they're not taking into consideration that we raised the racking and did consider that, and the water can flow underneath the panels and it's still going to be pretty resilient. Not all carriers will take, you know, some of those design and operational controls into consideration. So I think being very open about it. Reegan, I think you're exactly right. Having carriers go out and visit sites and understand it, also very, very helpful and important. This is an industry that innovates very rapidly, and unfortunately, most carriers don't innovate at that same speed. So pushing them along is beneficial.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's quite clear. And communication is definitely key. And perhaps going back to James, data is also key. And I'm maybe curious to hear a little bit more about how do you assess post-NatCat damage to the asset with this kind of data, or perhaps if you have any suggestions on this kind of mitigation strategies based on the data that is available.
Yeah, so we're very active in assessing damage post natural catastrophe for sites all over the place, and of all different sizes as well, and from different owner types. And we see there's probably a spectrum that we see, where on the one hand, certain owners will move very quickly and deploy a visual inspection through Raptor maps within hours of the event being complete and the site being safe to visit. In other cases, it takes more time for the owner to get their arms around what's occurred, to deploy resources, and then ultimately to get an inspection together. And so that can be a variation of months in some cases for sites that are very, very nearby, which just gives you a sense of the degree of preparedness out there in the market. So that's, there's variation to say the least in terms of how owners approach it. The other piece I'd say is that for those operators and owners that are thinking very ahead or a little more sophisticated in terms of their approaches here, the use of robotics has really sort of coming to the fore, and we're heavily involved in deploying autonomous technology, a ground robot, a drone, for instance, that can be remotely and automatically deployed to go do an inspection of what's occurred. That's obviously the quickest way to do it. And again, for owners that are prepared and have thought about this in advance, that hardware is already on site, and then it's just a matter of deploying it to go and conduct an inspection. And the other piece I'll add is that I wouldn't say it's just simply one analysis of a site post-event. It's important to have a frequency or a number of different inspections, because in damage that might not be as substantial or as evident, or maybe it's a little less obvious that there's been some micro cracking or damage that hasn't been readily observed, that can cause hotspots down the road. Cracks can propagate and cause issues, and that can create other problems for owners. So keeping again a good baseline before and after the event that's continuous allows teams to then say, here's ultimately what the damage was over a sort of a longer timeline.
Okay. Quite interesting how in the same region facing, I would say, the same catastrophe or a similar one, the response times you've seen are very different, or they have varied. So it's clear that the strategies are also different in place, or even the response times. So also why I guess we saw different responses to the poll before. Actually, that brings me to one of the questions from the audience that I see has popped up here from Walter. And it's about how often should stowing be tested. I think we spoke about it a little bit, that the insurance are looking at have they tested this before? And then the comparison made here is about how fire alarm systems have codified requirements, but solar has no codes or standards to follow. At least that's the statement. So I don't know if you could provide some insight on this question.
I can provide some, which is solar has codes, but has it blossomed as large as we know for commercial or residential construction or other industrial construction? Obviously not. We're too nascent of an industry, but there's still best practices that we can follow, and it comes to the ownership climate. Right? You just because there isn't a code that says you have to do it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So how often should Stow be tested? Certainly at commissioning, you need to have commissioning. Do you need to do it annually or maybe every 5 years? I think it's a good idea. I'm not terribly worried like what fundamentally changes over time 1 year after the other. The actual control system doesn't, but the availability of your tracker does, right? So are all your motors working? Are all your communication systems working? That's something that you can measure all the time. It's something that we measure at Silicon Ranch, understanding the availability of all the components within the tracker. Actually, something I'll be speaking about at NREL's PVRW conference. So if you have low availability, I would recommend that you should be testing this more often. If you have high availability of your system, you actually already have a pretty good health indicator, and maybe you don't need to test it as frequently. But it's a great topic, and it's something that we should all be picking up on and taking from other aspects of our life or other industries.
Yeah, I'm quite curious, Scott or Reegan, if you were to answer the question of how often should stowing be tested, what would your answer be?
From an operator perspective, I think it makes sense to be able to test it on a yearly basis. You need to be able to understand if that one button stow command is actually working or not. You do have the capability of stowing modules at night. If it is in a weather hail event area that maybe it makes sense to be able to stow it at a certain angle. And do you occasionally use the go button to initiate that? I think importantly as well is understanding your network throughout the site. Some of these projects are covering over 1,000 acres, over 2,000 acres, and are all the command units being able to receive the information as fast as possible. So when the control center hits the stow button, do all the command units receive that data and go into stow mode? And how fast does it take? Is it 2 minutes or is it 10 minutes? So I think there are certain things you need to be able to understand about the operations of the tracker, and is it performing as designed? Scott, interested in your thoughts?
Oh, agreed. So we certainly recommend testing the system during commissioning and during regularly scheduled maintenance. Over time, just making sure that everything's working properly. There's no vegetation that's been growing that's going to impede any movement of the tracker as designed, and for all the other reasons that Nick and Reegan mentioned.
Okay, good point. I hadn't even considered if there's some kind of vegetation growing that impacts the stowing. But yes, you never know what's going to happen. And I think this is quite pertinent to one of the topics we've discussed. And I'll ask this first to Isaac, because recently there's been a few articles I believe KWH has released on the topic of the trade-off between the loss in energy production and the potential impact of a natural catastrophe with regards to stowing. So just delving a bit more into that loss of energy production, and does it really impact your project in a negative way?
No, absolutely. So we had a hypothesis that when hail conditions exist, that it's during heavy cloud cover. And since we've got production data on a third of the industry, we did the math, we ran the numbers. What we found, and we presented these findings at PVRW, as well as provided that paper in our solar risk assessment. What we outlined is if you stow early and stow often, your output or revenue that you're generating is minimally impacted. So the number that we put to it is 0.1% if you're stowing in those severe convective storms that could accompany hail. So very, very small and beneficial, materially reduces your risk.
That's quite a low number, because one of the questions we have here from the audience is more of talking about IEC hail testing and how it allows up to 5% power loss. And the question is, how is this evaluated after the event and insured? I don't know if this is something that you also provide some insight on.
Yeah, so following a hail event, obviously, if there's physical damage on the top sheet of glass, the module needs to be replaced. We also know that some panels could be impacted by micro cracking. I think that's where, like, if you've done an assessment, assessment of the site, measured the level of micro cracks present before and after event, you can easily quantify the damage that the site saw. And as provided you don't have a micro crack exclusion on your policy, you can measure the damage that occurred at the site and be indemnified for it. Also, some panels are much more resilient to microcracking because they don't have that crystalline structure. So like thin film, for example. So there are various controls that are appropriate for various regions. Like as a carrier, we look at like hardware selection, and we've got a hierarchy that matters depending on where in the United States it is. But also, like, as you're measuring those, you need a before and after reading, because microcracks we know can occur through vibrations caused by wind, and that would be a series of events rather than one hail event. And so being able to measure before and after is important to understand the loss or the damage that occurred.
Thanks, Isaac. And I would like to remind the audience to put in any questions that they might have. We'll try to get through as many as we can, because we are reaching the last few minutes of the webinar. So please, now's the time to shoot them through to our panel of experts. But in the meantime, I'd like to, I think I jumped the question a little bit, to go back a little bit about that trade-off between stowing and loss in energy production, because that's quite interesting. And I don't know, Nick, does that number 0.1% loss, is that shocking to you? Is that what you expected? Or like, how does having this kind of information impact your NatCat strategy?
I think it does strike me as low, but I also think about what are the conditions that you're considering, and the type of storm or the type of projects. But ultimately, it is pretty low. What we see as the owner, it's not the actual stow that is the lost revenue opportunity, but it's getting back out of stow and back into production quickly. The resilience of your system that matters, right? So people can go in and put a stow on, and then, oh, we're done. Phew, we got through the storm. Meanwhile, we're all still at a non-beneficial angle. So it's the bounce back that is important to focus on. But really, it's not too high. What I am interested in is we have for hail, there's really few automatic sensors, but for high winds, this has been the standard for stow strategies for some time. Should we be stowing immediately just because the storm is coming, or should we just let the power plants and their sensors operate and go through and trigger when they see the wind? So I'm interested in what Isaac and Scott has to design that wind speed. Think about that.
I can speak to some of that. So from our vantage point, we're looking at a ramp rate of the wind. And so CPP is a pretty well-known wind testing firm within the industry. And they give us a little bit of guidance on, okay, how quick in terms of miles an hour per minute can we expect the wind speed to increase? And so one of the things they didn't talk about kind of in the queue up is there's this concept in the industry of a binary stow, which I think is what, Nick, more of what you're getting at, where there's a specific wind speed and then bang, the whole system goes to stow. Game Change takes a little bit more of a sliding scale approach, where as the wind speed increases, we'll restrict the allowable range of tilt angles so that by the time we get all the way up to that 70, 80 mile an hour, really severe event, the only angle that the control logic of the system will allow the panels to be at is that full stow angle, that most robust angle. And so that control logic and that sliding scale is set to match an expected ramp rate of the wind. So as the wind speed increases, we get closer to stow. Now that's only for kind of a non-hurricane high wind speed event, but that is one of the things we work into our control logic. Isaac, anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think it's very complicated. I think the best in class and what's most ideal is not always possible, but like if you're doing day ahead forecasting, where the supercells that can cause like damaging wind speeds and hail are going to occur. So you're paying attention to, am I going to have to go past tabletop to get into the optimal stow position, and paying attention to those is beneficial, but also very difficult. And Nick, I think you're absolutely right. Like putting into stow is easy, but it's not always easy to take it out of, or you got to make sure that you're thinking through the whole process. I think that makes sense. So like we do pay attention to like what are stow hierarchies between the events. If you're in a very high hail zone, we want to see a preference to hail, but if you're in a wind zone, it makes sense to stow wind over hail if damaging hail, which is greater than 2 inches or really even over 3.5 inches hail, that's where it can be especially damaging. It makes sense. And then also realizing like the size of the site may matter. So if you've got a massive site, it may be larger than the potential footprint of like damaging hail. And so you may need to take into consideration, do I split stow or do I favor wind slightly? It's very complicated. We don't fully have our arms around it, but carriers need to digest all of that, come up with a preference, and then work with the asset owners to understand.
Oh, Lorena, you're on mute.
What a classic situation when being as a call. But thank you. I was going to say that I'm trying to sneak in one more question from the audience before we wrap up. And here is a question from Adam asking about what kind of tracker data is critical for the post-damage assessment for insurance claims. And here there's things like wind speed, tracker alarm, meteorological data, measured hail size. I don't know if we could quickly let Adam know what kind of tracker data would be critical for this insurance claim.
Yeah, sure. For an insurance claim, we typically, as we respond to a site, we'll go out and we'll just assess damage. It is helpful to know like what the hail damage is. Sometimes we can infer that from damage that we've seen on the site. You'll get an idea for strikes. It is possible to put hail sensors on the site, which is really just foam blocks that are covered in aluminum foil so you can measure the impacts. I don't know if you've seen large hail, but it's actually kind of spiky because you have these water droplets that are building up layers of ice and they're spinning, and so they'll create spikes, which also can be very damaging. And so you'll see a very large, heavy hailstone hit a panel with the point. So it's nuanced, but if you've got those sensors where you're able to detect hail size and you have that information, it is helpful. And we do take that information in as we're calibrating our NatCat models to understand the risk, to say, like, what was the site that this, or what was the hail size that we saw at this site? How concentrated were the hail strikes? And some of that detail is helpful as we look to improve in the future.
Thanks, Isaac. There's definitely many questions here about insurance claims. I think it's an important part of the post-NatCat strategy. Maybe with that, I'd like to ask each of you for maybe your key takeaway on this topic. Feel free to say your final messages to the audience. I don't know, perhaps if each of you could also say something different in case there were to be the worst case scenario, a really bad natural catastrophe event impacting your solar site. What is one recommendation you would give as for one part of the strategy for this situation? And hopefully each of you will have a different one. I know that not ranking them by importance at all, but in this worst case scenario, I'd like to hear from each of you one suggestion you have for this mitigation strategy. And perhaps I'll start off with you, Reegan.
Data is everything. James started off well with having a good understanding of how the site looks, creating a digital twin, something you're able to bump up against after a hail event. I think data from a SCADA platform going into a control center with performance engineers who can identify potential blocks or even circuits that are producing less after versus before a hail event is key. James made another great point about using robotic insurance companies to even understand fire mitigation, backside of module tempers. You could do value propositions, not just doing thermography, going back and forth on a site, looking at front side of modules, looking for damage, but even backside of modules, even perimeter fencing. A robot can view that. So think about a robot, how we can utilize them to be able to understand post events, mitigate fire potential with backside module connectors, and even just roaming the site, vegetation height to fencing issues. It's all about data and what do you do with it.
Thank you, Reegan. And James, I don't know if Reegan stole your point, your shout out for data, but if you had to say worst case scenario, hail is coming, and what is one strategy you would recommend for people to deal with this problem?
Yeah, I just want to replay Reegan's comment. That was right on the money, I thought. No, I'd say don't get caught off guard. Don't let it catch you by surprise. In other words, there are lots of things that owners and operators can do in advance of a storm or catastrophe that can make the remediation or post-event process a lot smoother, faster, less painful. And I think Reegan hit the particulars in terms of having data and knowing exactly what occurred. But at Raptor Maps, we have lots of people who could, are happy to speak with customers about how to not be surprised by an event, because there's lots of things that can be put in place to make the process afterward not so painful.
All right, thanks, James. And how about you, Scott? Is there anything that you would suggest as that one special point of information?
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Make sure when you're buying your modules, when you're buying your rack, you're getting from OEMs who are tested by third parties, who are vetted, who've gone through the right tests for whatever climate conditions you have on your site. Great,
and to the point as well. Isaac, I'll follow up with you. That's a huge dark cloud is coming up. People have to manage dealing with the NatCat event. What would be your one input point of information? Yeah. I think you're muted.
I'm muted, yes. I think having that plan and understanding like what your site's capabilities are and implementing them and being able to implement them is important. I'd also say, and all these things that these other panelists have talked about will be the most impactful things you can do to help reduce your insurance costs and improve the terms that you get, but also having a plan that when a loss occurs, how do you get it back? Do you have spare parts, or do you have a line on how you would repower a site where necessary? That's one of those areas where you can see prolonged delays in getting back operational. So that's another thing that builds resilience into your operation.
Great. And Nick, this might be a little bit difficult because they've all had shared great points, but if this hurricane has come and passed, and if you had to point out one particular recommendation, what would it be?
Yeah, I can't really say preparation anymore or communication. I might say be open and transparent about it. The event happened, right? Maybe a little bit afterwards. You had hail. Is be open and transparent. If you're going to be, oh yeah, nothing to see here, a little bit of hail, a little bit of hurricane, people don't believe it, or people are not wired to believe it right now. They're very on edge, right? So I think that to be transparent with your carriers, transparent with your service providers, your lenders, will go a long way. And that, while yeah, maybe you did have some heavy damage, maybe it was something. You will then stand in the future as someone who did care, did have pride in ownership, and did the right thing. We're all we have many decades of operations to come as an industry. So I'll go to transparency.
Well, thank you, Nick. And that's, I think, a great way to round off this webinar and this conversation we've been having for an hour, but at least for me, it seems like it flew by because it's quite interesting. And I'd like to let the audience know that you can also claim a 10% discount on the asset management event that we'll be having in San Diego in April. So if you'd like to potentially meet some of our speakers in person and continue the discussion about NatCat, you can do so there. And I invite you all to join. But with that, I think this is our last slide. I'd like to thank all of you speakers, Reegan, James, Isaac, Nick, and Scott, for sharing your expertise and taking time of your day to support the evolution of the industry with better strategies. And I hope to see you all in the near future.
All right.
Thank you. And with that, we
Thanks,
close the webinar.
All right. Tot ziens, Lorena.
Doei.
Thank you all.